Perfect. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone. It's traditional in Australia to begin by paying respects to and acknowledging the First Nations peoples on whose land we meet. And I would like to pay my respect to the Gumbaynggirr Nation here in the mid-north coast of what is now called New South Wales. And I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. So thank you very much for having me. I'm staring at my own slide and not really looking at you, but I'm imagining the 6 or 7 of you who are out there. And as you may or may not tell, I'm English by birth, but I've lived in Australia for the last 35 years, and really my on-the-ground experience, direct experience of praxis around sustainability has been largely in Australia as an NGO, as a consultant and as an academic. Tonight I'm going to share with you, it might seem esoteric at first, but I want to look at what's happening inside Australia's plantations, and in particular the plantations of New South Wales and the mid-north coast of New South Wales, basically from our Newcastle, which is 100 kilometres or so north of Sydney, to the Queensland border, an area about 500 kilometres and about 150 kilometres wide. So I'm talking about an area bigger than, or round about the same size as the UK, I suppose. And I want to talk about something that is a brand new and emerging issue that no one has really encountered before or dealt with before, because conservation efforts around Australia's native forests have been largely focused on protecting old growth, looking after threatened species, and the remnant native vegetation inside our plantations have been largely overlooked. But they're important areas because very often they are all that's left, and when they are cleared as plantations are managed, there is a very large cumulative impact. And I want to take you through this little story, and if you're interested in being part of the Citizen Scientist initiative that I'm involved in, you're very welcome to contact me, and you can see my email down at the bottom there, t.cadman@griffith.edu.au. But forests are very dear to my heart because as a 7-year-old, coming home from my primary school in Cringleford in Norfolk one day, I was horrified to find that the woodlands that were at the start of my street had been cleared, and there was a swathe about 5 miles long of a series of bulldozers that had created the upgrade of what I later found out was called the A11. And the loss of forests had a really profound impact on me as a young boy, and it made me realise that we need to protect our native environments and our forests as much as we can. As a young person, of course, I was thinking of the recreation and amenity. I wasn't really thinking about the species, but I guess I've kind of taken that passion about trees and forests into my life here, first in Tasmania and now for the last 20 years in New South Wales. So I'm going to take you into a story about logging in New South Wales and how the Forestry Corporation of New South Wales is changing the landscape. And I want to talk to you about mapping native forest conversion. And I'll basically be showing you how to use shapefiles, how I've imported maps, and how I've used images, and also how I've engaged in ground truthing using Google Earth. So first of all, let me start with basically the latest report on forest loss and conversion by the Forestry Corporation of New South Wales. And I'll now get out of my slideshow and go into the first section of the Google Earth presentation. So, Paul, can you see my globe?
Yes, yeah, we can see Google Earth.
Okie dokie. So here we are in Down Under. In 1788, this is essentially in green, the area of native forest that was on the continent. Now you can see essentially the areas in pink are forests that have been cleared. The areas in orange are those forests that have been degraded, and the areas that are still green are those forests that are intact. So if we move into the mid-north coast of New South Wales, you can see there at the top, some of you may have heard of Byron Bay. You can see Newcastle there and Sydney right down at the bottom of the screen. You can see how most of the area has been degraded, and you can see the areas that are still just about hanging in there on what is called the New England tablelands and the Great Dividing Range, still in green. That's what's left, it's essentially of intact forest here on the eastern seaboard of New South Wales. I've now turned on the fire scar of Black Summer. And you can see how most of that fire is now overlying those green areas as well as the other forest areas. And if I turn on the orange, which are our national parks, you can also see the impact of the recent fires on our national parks. The area that I've just turned on in white are our state forests. These are forests that are managed for wood production. And it is inside those forests that not only do we have native forest logging activities, but we also have plantations. And it's really the plantations that I want to focus on today. So the forests of the eastern seaboard in New South Wales are managed under what's called the Coastal Integrated Forestry Operations Approval Process, which is a fancy term for saying the neoliberal economic regime has taken control of our forests and they're having the crap logged out of them. I've now turned on the green, which are essentially the compartments, the specific individual compartments within each of those state forests that are available for wood production. And what I want to do now is show you the extent to which Australia's forests and New South Wales's forests have been essentially systematically converted for plantation establishment. So I'm going to turn on a data set that is the database of all New South Wales's plantation hardwood forests, not softwood, so hardwood eucalypt forests that existed in the year 2000. You can see they're concentrated largely around Coffs Harbour. I'm in Bellingen, that little town to the south there, and I'll zoom in. You can see we're one of the heartlands, if you like, of plantation establishment. and some also around Port Macquarie. I'll turn on the plantation areas as they exist now. I'll turn off the 2000 layer, and you can see there has been a relatively significant expansion of that plantation estate. So we move from the cyan blue to the magenta pink. These have all been established, obviously, at the expense of native forests. I'll now turn on what is called the plantable area. So beyond this particular level of plantations as they exist now, there is a broader agenda around plantation establishment. I call this the measle map. So you can see just how extensive the conversion of our natural forest ecosystems is both planned for and as currently exists. So I want to talk to you a little bit about those plantations. So just bear with me while I get out of the main screen share, end show. And I'll go into my main presentation for Edge Hill. Still working, Paul?
Yes, all good.
All right, so essentially we are experiencing severe forest loss and our forests are being monoculturalised. We're seeing the expansion of plantations in New South Wales, and we're seeing the clearance of native vegetation and forests in New South Wales plantations, particularly using the Plantations and Reforestations Act, an act that's meant to stipulate the conditions under which plantations can exist, but has essentially become a driver for deforestation through the code. And I'd also like to look at a particular case study about what's happening on the ground. I'll share you the results and conclusions of that particular investigation, and if you're interested, what you can do to be involved. So in a nutshell, native forests are being converted to plantations. Our native forests are being simplified, so the mixed species are being essentially cut down and being only certain individual species, particularly in our area, coastal blackbutt, are being preferenced. Forest remnants inside plantations are being cleared. Eucalyptus plantations that were previously 3 or 4 species are now being simplified to monoculture. And those eucalypt plantations, often of specially managed and bred stock, are now hybridizing with the natural forest. We can't just simply say, oh, forest logging is terrible, we'll end native forest logging, and think that we can solve the problem of biodiversity loss in our forests in Australia, particularly if the current plantation mindset persists, whether we're talking about softwood or hardwood forests, because there will continue to be a driver to convert our forest estate to plantations. The next comment is important because I have lived in Britain and we get a bit confused in Britain, and I have to say Germans and Europeans are even more confused. Europe and the British Isles have simplified their forests to such an extent that people are basically confused about the difference between a plantation and a forest. And that's largely because the Forestry Commission, particularly in the UK in the post-war period, went through a massive process of essentially plantation conversion, cutting down our oak, ash and beech forests and replacing them with spruce and conifers. But that is not a forest, it's a plantation. And timber, like carrots or like wheat or like any other commodity that's grown for human consumption, is a crop. And we need to move away from seeing our crops, our timber crops, as forests. Our timber is a crop and it belongs in the agricultural landscape. It belongs on farmland. It does not belong in our woodlands, and we cannot, as we say in Australia, see our forests as a magic pudding that we can keep going to and taking and taking and taking and expecting the ecosystem to continue to support itself and support us and regulate our climate. Native forests, and I argue controversially, eucalypt plantations have more value for their ecosystem services, for climate and biodiversity, than they do for timber, and we need to restore them, not degrade them. But unfortunately, that is happening not just in our native forest estate as part of ongoing native forest logging operations, but through the Plantations and Reforestation Act, largely because it has these very weird definitions about plantations. It's quite weasel wordy. So a plantation is an area of land, according to the Act, on which the predominant number of trees or shrubs forming or expected to form the canopy are trees or shrubs that have been planted. Okay, fair enough. But then it says whether by sowing seed or otherwise. So this is not about getting a sapling and digging a hole in the ground and putting the tree in. This is also including what's referred to as silvicultural regrowth. So you might go in and clear fall an area and it might resprout naturally, or you might sow seed either aerially or just through other dispersal methods, or allow seeded regrowth to occur naturally. In New South Wales, because of this act, that counts as a plantation. So there, from the very beginning, you can see the danger as to the confusion between what is a natural forest and what is a plantation, and what the Act allows, particularly when it goes on to say a natural forest is not a plantation for the purposes of this Act. Again, that's fine. However, an area is not a natural forest merely because it contains some native trees or shrubs that have not been planted. And it is those some native trees or shrubs that have not been planted that are being destroyed across the landscape. This is essentially driven by the Plantation and Reforestation Code, which does not permit clearing of remnant vegetation, which anyone in the forest game outside New South Wales knows is called conversion. However, unless the area is, according to the Department of Primary Industries, who run this and not the Environment Protection Authority, the area is, according to their definition, degraded, and their definition is completely unclear. If the area is less than 1 hectare, if it impacts on plantation design or intrudes into another plantation, so the Director General can then give a general waiver for that area of natural vegetation to be cleared. Or if an area of vegetation to be cleared is more than 10% of the entire area, it can't be cleared, or more than 30 hectares, it can't be cleared, except it can because it is allowed to be offset. In other words, if you take it, you find some other area either within the plantation unit itself, or you find another area somewhere else. But the intention of that component is that you are replacing like for like or better. You're not just finding a crappy bit of bush over here and swapping that out. But unfortunately, that is what is happening. And the end result of these Orwellian sets of regulation is that the government can say, on one hand, there is no conversion in New South Wales, but it's a legal fiction. And unfortunately, we can't go to the Environmental Protection Agency because the DPI, the Department of Primary Industry, manages plantations, or rather it oversees its regulation, and the Forestry Corporation of New South Wales answers to DPI with its plantations, whereas for its native forests, it answers to the Environmental Protection Authority. So we get this bizarre situation where, although the EPA still oversees the loss of threatened species, if you report the loss of threatened species inside an area of plantation that is undergoing conversion, which, if you remember, in New South Wales does not exist, you will get this response: "Oh, I'm sorry, that's not possible. The area is a plantation." So you get caught in a loop of logic that basically has now become a driver for conversion across the landscape. So this is the results section of the case study that I'm going to take you to look at now. But I have to now get out somehow. It seems to think I have to end show, so I will end show, and I'll now go back to Google Earth. Are you all still happy?
Very happy, very good.
All right, okay, so I've shown you that we're in state forests. I've shown you that we have production areas within compartments. I've shown you the 2000 plantation data set, and I'm now focusing on plantations as they currently exist. And I want to take us to a particular area that is currently live, i.e. is being actively logged, called conglomerate state forest. And I want to take you through the story of what's happening in that area. So obviously you can see an area that's a clear fell area with some remnant vegetation in there. But using conglomerate state forest and using another area in New South Wales, I want to go through what I am now calling a new phenomenon called micro-conversion. It's this micro-conversion, it's this little fragment here, it's this little fragment there, and I'll now turn it back to 2017, which is much more pleasurable on the eye, and I'll get rid of that clear fell to the left. And I want to show you what I mean by micro-conversion. So essentially there are three components as I identify them in micro-conversion. So conversion is something that you may or may not be familiar with. You're all sustainability practitioners and knowledge makers, so you'll understand how Indonesia is burning and clearing huge amounts of wetland and peatland and native forest to put palm oil in. And palm oil is essentially the lubricant of our entire industrial capitalist system. It feeds us, it washes our hair, it contributes to the softness of plastics, it goes in our bubble bath, it works as lubricants in our machinery, and now increasingly it's being converted into eco-fuel and put in things like aeroplanes. It is the coconut of the late capitalist era. And it has marched its way across Asia and has decimated forests in its wake. We're also probably familiar, all of us, with soybeans, the same issue, particularly in the Brazilian Amazon with the rancheros, who are essentially slashing and burning, and in their wake it's establishing either soybean plantations or cattle. Well, one of the other aspects of conversion beyond soy and palm oil and cattle is timber, and timber which is grown in plantations. And that process of replacing natural forest with an industrial commodity crop is conversion. But there are really three types of conversion in what I call the micro-conversion landscape. The first two, we're probably, all of us are probably familiar with the idea of forest degradation and deforestation. But there is a third category that I also want to explore within the plantation landscape. But I just want to go through them all first. So I want to talk about and present an example of what is called degradation. So I've turned on just one of those plantation units. And I want to show you the area as it existed in the year 2000. So it's a slightly different configuration of the area, and you'll notice it's got what I call this star-shaped area in the middle of the plantation. And what has essentially happened to that area is it's been subsumed into the broader plantation using the Plantation and Reforestation Act and basically disappeared. But if we go to the forest class system of the comprehensive and adequate and representative reserve system assessment that was undertaken across Australia in the 1990s, and we turn on the forest classification there, we can see that the area in question was originally not in the plantation at all. If we look at the forest class here in the data that was collected in the late 1990s, you can see this area was called recently disturbed. I think any of us with a decent eye can see this is even-aged regrowth. But when we go to the star-shaped area, you can see that is not regrowth. For those of you who are interested, the light green is rainforest, and the large canopy trees are old growth trees. I'm not sure what the resolution's like, but for those of you with good eyes, you can see even the palms that are growing within the area, thanks to the wonders of Google Earth and its resolution algorithms. But when we turn on that plantation layer as it exists now, surprise, surprise, that plantation, area of old growth and rainforest has just basically disappeared into the plantation. Now, if we turn on the forest as it exists now, I'll go back to January of this year because it's better resolution. You can see there is still some forest left, but it's been pretty heavily moth-eaten. But what's interesting is if you turn on the aerial photography of 1974, the ground zero for this particular area of forest, and you turn back on that original plantation inside the plantation, and you turn on the forest classification, you can see how originally this area was identified in some shape or form, and that star area, although never given any formal designation in the conservation assessment process, was clearly identified. And it's very interesting to watch what has happened to that area in this recent logging event. So I just want to focus in on the star-shaped area and show you essentially what we can see has happened here. So I'll turn on again 1974. And what I've done is I've created a polygon of the original remnant forest in red, and then in blue I've outlined using the latest aerial photography what has been cleared. And that's happened across this particular plantation area or sub-unit within conglomerate. But this essentially is degradation. You can see there's still some forest. It's been heavily moth-eaten, and in the case of the star-shaped area here, it's been really impacted, and the rainforest has been severely compromised ecologically. But it's still there in some shape or form. So I want to look at another example within the same plantation area. Excuse me. A little further to the north. I call this one the spearhead. And this is an example of what I call deforestation. So let me turn on the aerial photograph of 1980. And let's just focus in on those two particular plantation compartments. So this was ground zero in 1980. So the difference between the last one is you can see there were still some corridors and connections. It was all pretty moth-eaten and not a good look. But here you can see almost everything has gone, except this area of remnant native forest to the southwest. And surprise, surprise, if we turn on the plantation units as they existed in the year 2000, that's the bright cyan there. You can see originally this area to the southwest was much smaller and was not part of the plantation. But the native forest has been annexed as a consequence of the act and subsequently largely eradicated. So what I've done here is to turn on the area in red, which marks the remnant native forest. Outlined in blue is the area that was cleared, and in green are the areas that they have supposedly swapped out as the biodiversity offset. And if we go back to the photograph here, we can see exactly how much native vegetation has gone. Almost all of it, with some post-1974 regrowth as an offset, but significant areas of the original pre-1974 forest, quite possibly old growth, quite possibly rainforest, that has gone. And then just lastly, the final category of what I call microconversion, beyond degradation and deforestation, is what I technically refer to as obliteration. So this is an area further south. This is just 5 kilometers from where I live. It's one tiny plantation unit in an area called Tarkeith State Forest. And I want to show you what's happened here. So if we turn on 1972, which was ground zero for this area, you can just about see in the aerial photograph two remnant patches of native forest within this admittedly small plantation unit. This is only about 3 hectares, whereas the ones we've just been looking at were, in the case of the first one, well over 50 hectares, and in the case of the latter, around 15 hectares. This one's only 3 hectares. But as you can see, when you saw all the pink across the map of northern New South Wales, this is happening in just about every single plantation. And if I turn off 72, you can see there is nothing left in that plantation, but you can see where the original trees still were. We even have some lying down, and they're still there today. This is a aerial photograph from 2017. And just for the hell of it, I'll go back to 2004. And here you can see, yes, this is quite clearly planted forest over here, but there's been quite a lot of regrowth beyond the original remnant native forest. And this was essentially a recovering native forest that has basically been stopped in its tracks. And I'm hoping you're not all getting depressed, but unfortunately the world is in a bit of a grim situation. But it's really important that as researchers and as conservation advocates that we become sensitized to these issues and that we take action on these issues. And so I just want to finish the Google Earth presentation with a final kind of show in all its glory, one particular area within conglomerate, 3 units together. Just have to turn on the, okay, here we go. So I call this one the happy puppy playing with a map of Tasmania. This rather strange configuration here in the middle. So this is how the area looked in 2017. This is how it looked in 1980. You can see the first of the clearing of the native forest in the map of Tasmania to the right there. And then by 1984, there'd been some serious efforts to clear the remaining area within these 3 units. But interestingly, if you look at the plantation configuration as it existed in the year 2000, you can see that this significant patch of native forest, this is about 5 or 6 hectares, was not originally part of the plantation, but has subsequently been annexed. And so I'll now turn on those layers again. I'll turn off 1984 and 1980. Here we can see the forest basically at its full maturity with this plant called plantation area in the middle, but there's no evidence of planting. This is basically, again, regrowth from logging, naturally occurring forest, regrowing after logging, but it's been designated plantation. And then here we can quite clearly see what has been lost, what has been retained, and where we are with the figures today. And then just to finish, so that you have a picture of exactly how significant this is across this particular plantation area. This is the 4 areas that have been completed within the logging that I've done this investigation of. And I'll just turn on the Landsat image, which is lower resolution, but it shows you that this is an active operation and it is still ongoing. And I'm trying through this process to raise awareness, particularly through certification schemes, because this is certified under the Australian Forestry Standard. It's a bit like your UQAS, your UK Woodland Assurance Scheme. It's an eco-labelling scheme which doesn't allow conversion. I'm trying to raise awareness within that system of just exactly what is going on in New South Wales. And I'm winding up now, Paul, so hopefully we'll have time for some questions. So I'll just, to summarise, of the 109 hectares of the new plantation configuration, 31 hectares was remnant vegetation, 12.5 hectares have been cleared, and 12 hectares have been retained. But as I explained earlier, that was not really like for like. That was regrowth versus mature forest and or old growth. And if you look at the statistics across the 100 hectares and the way that the forest has increased in size, you can see really that a large amount of the native forest that was taken was simply annexed and called plantations sometime between 2000 and now. So as I said, more remnant vegetation is being cleared than is being retained and offset. The retained offset forest is sourced from post-clearing regrowth. The current units are larger than in 2000. Native forest has been annexed from adjacent state forest, and cleared remnant vegetation includes old growth and rainforest. Now, New South Wales has over nearly 900,000 hectares of hardwood plantations, according to ABARES, our statistics, federal statistics people. If the figures that I've identified in conglomerate are indicative of other locations, large areas of remnant native forest are just being disappeared and rendered extinct invisibly because they're a plantation and they don't exist. So if you want to get involved, please raise the alarm that no conversion in New South Wales, according to our government, is a legal fiction. And if you want to get involved, and in fact this is a methodology that can be equally applied to all the precious little bits of woodland in the UK and across the world, and I'm very happy to help anybody and show anybody the methodology. And I'd like you to adopt a plantation, the poor relative of the forest family, and learn how to use Google Earth and aerial photography to spot conversion, how to lodge complaints and prevent them if you can. And your work will be part of a project to help protect and raise awareness about the impacts on biodiversity and how you can provide real-time updates for communities, researchers, activists and campaigners. And I'll just finish on a happy slide. This is the headwaters of the Kalang River. It's one of the 3 rivers that provide the drinking water for the Shire, Bellingen Shire, in which I live, and for the 3 townships of the 39,000 hectares of the Shire. And you're in Oaks Forest, Oaks State Forest. This area was scheduled for logging last month, but some of us have camped out overnight for quite a few weeks, actually within the logging compartment, and forestry's got cold feet and has decided that this forest can stay standing for another day, and we can take the fight to them another day. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tim, for the absolutely fabulous and highly quotable presentation. Really interesting, and for me, it's wonderful, wonderfully timed. Follows on in terms of my teaching activities with recent sessions on sustainability and environmental activism and things like that. And I can see some of my students have come along today. I'm just going to switch the recording off, and then we'll open up things up for discussion.